team thinking sports were a good way to make sure the kids stayed on the right path, but then they saw Fabio Paim. The social worker I just mentioned once said, "From the moment I saw him, I already knew one day I'd be on TV telling this story, the story of how I stumbled upon the greatest player of all time." Unfortunately, that isn't the case. Immediately they began pestering the young boy to make sure he joined the squad, but even after he said yes, there was a problem. The tournament he would be playing in was for kids over 7 years old. Regardless, they were so desperate to see him in action that they just gave him another kid's ID card and told him to pretend he was someone else. As dumb as it sounds, it actually worked, and everyone who saw him lost their minds over how good he was, which only became more impressive when their whole charade fell apart and everyone realized it was even younger than they thought. They say in training he was something from another world. His coach once said to reporters, "The shortest training session I ever gave came because of him. He kept destroying everyone. He dribbled one kid, then another, and found himself in midfield with the keeper slightly off center. He swung his foot over the ball, rotated 45 degrees, and with the heel of his foot smashed it into the top corner. I stood there, grabbed a whistle, and told the kids, it's over. After something like this, there's no point in continuing practice." The following season, in yet another youth tournament, the team luckily found themselves to be facing none other than Sporting CP, Portugal's most prestigious academy, which brought us talents like Futre, Figo, Quaresma, Nani, and of course, Cristiano Ronaldo. That day the match ended 3-1 in favor of Sporting, but the biggest winner was Fabio Paim. Besides scoring his team's only goal, he had repeatedly embarrassed the Sporting squad so often that it left them with no other choice but to sign him, reaching an agreement for him to join at the end of the season. Other clubs came, but the staff at his team refused every offer, no matter the amount, believing an academy like Sporting was the only place for a kid like Paim. They wanted the best for him, to succeed above all else. It was the lack of this sort of guidance that would be his demise later on. In 1997, he finally arrived at Sporting, but he wasn't the only talent who had just seemingly fallen right onto their doorstep. There was another kid, a bit more shy, around 2.5 years older, who had just arrived from Madeira. His name was Cristiano, and from the get-go the comparisons began, and just as quickly, a conclusion was reached. Fabio was not just better, he was much better. Right on his first year, he completely took over the squad, and by the age of 13, he wasn't just their main man, he was bigger than the whole thing put together. He became so famous for his talent that thousands of fans would show up to every training session just to watch him. But it wasn't just the local fans. Every club with a few million laying around was scouting him. It is even said that the French national team promised him a house, a car, jobs for every one of his family members, and an obscene wage so that he would move to their country and vow to file for citizenship in order to play for them instead of Portugal. You don't hear something like that every day. Besides this, as you might imagine, agents began surrounding him like vultures, and in the end, Jorge Mendes was the one to snatch him. It was around the time he turned 15 that things began escalating. At that point, Ronaldo moved to United, and as the world stared completely in awe of a young CR7, he was asked by a reporter how he was able to adapt to the Premier League so easily, and he replied, "If you think I'm good, then you should see Fabio Paim." If Sporting were already under pressure from big clubs, now with Jorge Mendes becoming his agent and Ronaldo pulling off the greatest unintentional marketing stunt of the decade, Sporting were forced to bulletproof their Wonder Kid's contract, and so, at 15 years of age, he began earning more than most first-team players. If Paim had always shown to be reckless, getting bad grades, staying up late and going missing from time to time, once all the money arrived, it was hard for the young boy not to become a loose cannon. If most people who climb to fame usually mess up by forgetting where they came from, Paim suffered from the exact opposite. He remained too dependent on his childhood friends' approval. So, with his first lump of cash, he bought a massive house with a pool right by his old street. They say that's exactly when it all went to hell. Friends were over 24/7, and Paim seemed stuck in a loop, constantly trying to impress them by keeping the party going non-stop and blowing his money on frivolous things. First, a convertible Mercedes Mercedes, then a Porsche, even a Ferrari and a Lamborghini. His 10-car garage was full before he was even old enough to get a license. But don't think that stopped him. In an interview he admitted he was already frequently driving them, saying they were automatics, so you just gotta step on the gas and steer away. Regardless, at that point he still performed on the pitch. He finished the season with an impressive 28 goals in 29 games and was the first one to admit that regardless of his talent he had to work harder and harder every day if he was to achieve his goals. But then, to add fuel to the fire, he got injured, really bad, to the point where he needed knee surgery. With nothing to do, he struggled to keep focused, and by the time he came back, the numbers began dwindling and the worries began taking center stage. By 2007, Pain had turned 19 years old, and if Ronaldo was preparing himself for the season that would bring him his first Ballon d'Or, Pain was yet to make the first team at Sporting, though he had now represented Portugal at the youth level, even being handed the iconic number 7 shirt. Still, as much as they suspected he wasn't at all ready to take the step into professional football, with his age about to creep into the 20s, Sporting felt forced to get him some minutes, and so he was sent on loan to Olivais e Moscavide in the Portuguese second tier. It was supposed to be a good middle term. He would get some playing time at a higher level without being exposed to the pressures of first tier football. However, by the end of the season he had accumulated 11 matches with 9 defeats and 2 draws, not a single win, and as many red cards as he had goals. As you might imagine, they were relegated and Pain's motivation was at an all-time low. His next club was Trofense, on loan yet again, and no matter how well they were doing in the second tier, Pain began getting impatient and insisting he should be playing at the highest level. So he moved yet again on loan as per usual to Passos Ferreira in the Portuguese first division. Suddenly, playing time became scarce once again, and after finding some players were just as reckless as him, his biggest memory from the club was going on a trip to Mexico without even packing any bags, just him and a credit card. By the time he came back, he had 3 suitcases full of new clothes. This was the last straw for many people. He even got his last ever call-up for the youth ranks of the Portuguese national team. It seemed it was officially over, but then he got a second opportunity he couldn't have even dreamed of. Luís Filipe Scolari had just left the command of the Portuguese national team in order to take over at Chelsea following Mourinho's dramatic exit, and alongside him he brought a bunch of Portuguese players, from Deco to Bozingua, Ricardo Quaresma, and finally, as Abramovich caved to his every whim, Fábio Paim on loan with an option to buy at the end of the season. It was incredible to see, from being denied a place at Passos de Ferreira to playing for an European giant like Chelsea in a matter of months. That's the kind of magic a man like Jorge Mendes can pull off. Clearly he had always been a lucky guy, but this was off the charts. However, he very much did not make the most of it. There are a bunch of stories from his time there. Once, he asked Drogba to pick him up from his house on the way to training, only